Good morning to everyone. Good evening or afternoon, or if you're a hardy soul in Europe, good night. So today, like he said, I'm going to talk about our approval pathway for PRRS-resistant pig in China. So I work at PIC. I've been at PIC over 20 years. PIC is a global pig breeding company. Our parent company is Genus, which is one of the sponsors of this group. It's an English company traded on the London Stock Exchange. One of our purposes at PIC is really to select for pigs to be better, to grow faster, to have bigger litters. One of the challenging areas for us is to improve is traits like robustness. How in a challenged environment, say a disease break, how do we make the pig not just survive, but actually thrive? So we've done a fair bit of research in disease resilience, but in parallel, we've been looking at ways of making pigs resistant to some very common viruses. One of our early successes was through a partnership with the University of Missouri and the use of gene editing to make pigs resistant to PRRS. And I'll describe that virus in a moment. I'm talking about China. I live in China. I've been in China for 10 years. It's one thing to understand in China, the regulatory process today is a GMO framework, genetically modified organism framework for animals. And so that's the process we're in. It is also a restricted technology. So foreign companies cannot directly commercialize into China. So like PIC has been in China since 1996. We have a wholly owned company, but still considered foreign. So we had to find a partner. So we chose Beijing Capital Agribusiness, BCA. We licensed the trait to them, and they go through this process of the regulatory process, and then they have that potential to commercialize. So I'm representing both PIC and BCA. I am the liaison with them over all these years and been very much integrated in part of this process that they've going through in China. So they asked me to represent them. So first, let's talk about PRRS. PRRS is a pretty devastating virus. First of all, it's been around for 3 decades. It stands for porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome, okay? So for pregnant females, it can cause abortions, sickness and abortions. For young pigs, it can cause mortality. In the pigs that actually live, usually it can have a permanent effect on the rest of their lives. It also suppresses their immune system and leads very often to secondary infections. So a lot of pneumonias or different bacterias, mycoplasmas, have an impact, which then leads to increased antibiotic use. So if we look in the US, over 60% of the sow herds are PRRS positive, okay? In Asia, I don't know what the estimate is, but I'm confident it's higher than 60%. The vaccines today, really, they decrease the severity of the disease, but they do not confer resistance, okay? So they have some impact, but it doesn't confer resistance. So, and the impact to the US industry is over 600 million. The most latest update on that is over 1 billion. So if we look in Asia and the impact, I've not seen good estimates on that, but it's high. It has a global impact. And if we look around the world, if you look at all the countries in red, these are where PRRS is endemic. So in Asia, very red, okay? Australia, New Zealand have done a good job of keeping it out. South Africa, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile have been the countries that have been able to keep it out. The rest of us have to deal with this disease on an ongoing basis. So we partnered with the University of Missouri, with Randy Prather's group, and through gene editing technology, he was able to discover if we can remove domain 5 of this gene CD163, we remove the binding site for the virus to enter the cell, okay? So this is a protein that's expressed in the cell wall of specific cells expressed in the lungs, okay? And so we remove this section, the virus can't enter the cell, it can't replicate, and the pig is completely resistant to the disease. And once you remove this section, this removal can be passed on to the parents. Now, you need 2 copies of this removal, okay? So it needs to be in a homozygous state. If it's heterozygous, the virus can still enter the cell and can still replicate. So the pig can still get sick. So you need it in a homozygous state, okay? Now, let's move on to the China regulation. Like I said, we're currently under a GMO framework. So if we look on the right and we look at today it's regulated by MARA, Ministry of Agriculture and Rural Affairs. And they would have 3 different groups that you have to work with. One is this National Agriculture Biosafety Tech Committee. This is the group that sets the standards, the general guidelines and the rules. The Biosafety Committee is the practical group that we have to interact with to get the biosafety certificate. So this is a group of experts and different officials that evaluate each application, and they set the very specifics of what experiments have to be done. And then this third group, this is a third-party group that evaluates the edit, the GMO, the actual, what you've actually done, okay? So if we go over to the legislation here, there's 3 types. You have animals, plants, and microorganisms. Today we're talking about animals. Animals have to go through a 5-phase evaluation, and I'll describe that in the next slide. And in that process, there's a notification process on some of the phases, and there's approval process in some of the phases. And I'll highlight those as we go through the 5 different phases. So if you're a domestic company in China and you do the research, your first step is to do the research, I'm going to talk about pigs. You create a pig or 2, you do your edits or your genetically modified, you make sure the trait that you're trying to get is evaluated. So you pull all that, if you're successful, you pull all that data together, and then you go through a notification process to the Biosafety Committee, okay? You're going to inform them of what you did in your research and what you plan to do in the intermediate test. You're informing them you're starting the intermediate test, okay? Now, if you're a foreign company working through a partner like us on biosafety, or with the Biosafety Committee, you actually have to go through an approval process here. You submit all your research data, they approve or don't approve for you to move into the intermediate test. The intermediate test is now you're ramping up from a couple pigs to now a larger sample size. So you're doing very similar type of research and experiments, but a larger sample size. So then you put all that data together, cumulative with everything you've done. You then submit it to go through an approval process to then move on to the environmental release stage. In this one, again, it's just bigger sample size. Very often you're going to have to do very similar experiments, just much larger scale. You then put all that data together in a cumulative submission to then go through an approval process to move into the production test stage, where then you have to go up to 10,000 animals in that. You put all that data together for a final submission to then be evaluated if you get that biosafety certificate or if you don't. Okay, so this is the GMO framework that we're currently under. The reality is today, no animal product has actually gotten a biosafety certificate in China. So different groups are at different stages of this, but none have actually received that to this day. So here is the data that's actually required. One, you have to do molecular characterization. You have to look at the DNA part that you changed. You have to look at RNA expression. You have to look at protein. You have to look, in case of gene edit, you have to look at off targets. You have to do whole genome sequencing and whatnot. Secondly, you have to show genetic stability. Will this stay stable through multiple generations? You have to look at the health status. Did your changes in the genome have any kind of negative impact to the pig, whether it's their health status, behavior, appearance, or physiological indicators, but also their trait impacts? Does it have a negative impact on other traits? So, for example, like in the case of CD163, this is a scavenger protein that is used for some innate immune functions. So by removing just domain 5, research is showing that that protein is still functional in its known functions, yet still resistant to PRRS. So you have to demonstrate those things. What's the adaptability of this change to the environment? This is where you need the larger sample size. And then you have to look at escape release evaluation. If it goes into the wild, what would be the impact? And obviously food safety. We mentioned that in the intro. This is very important on allergens, toxicity, compositional analysis and whatnot. These are very standard for many companies. Now, in those 5 phases, you don't have to do all of these. So for example, molecular characterization, it's likely that in the intermediate test and the environmental test, you have to do that, but you probably don't have to. But the committee, it's a case-by-case basis. Their requirements are going to be different for every application. So what exact experiments have to be done in each depends on your application. So let's move on to gene editing in China. The government has shown a real positive attitude. In 2020, MARA published the promotion and development of modern seed industry. 2 years later, they published the guidelines for gene-edited plants. 1 year after that, the first biosafety certificate was granted to high oleic soybeans. A year before, in 22, they developed an IPO review innovation board to really encourage the startup of companies and the helping them to be able to achieve IPOs. So they're encouraging commercialization of this. So if we then look at gene-edited animals, like I showed you before, today we're under a GMO framework. We've got to go through these 5 steps, okay? For gene-edited plants, they go through the intermediate test and they go straight to the biosafety certificate. It is expected that animal guidelines will be similar, but until they publish, we don't know that for sure. So this would be our outlook for the PRP trait in China. So today we're going through the intermediate test stage, so 2024 and 25. We believe that we will start application for the environmental release sometime in 25 to then do those experiments, and sometime in 26 to do the biosafety certificate application. Now, what you can see here, I'm showing a hybrid. If it's full GMO, we're missing the production stage, so we may have to add that. But if it's gene edited the way we expect, it may just stop at intermediate test. It's uncertain. So until those regulations are published, this is just our current thinking, but we're very flexible. We've been working very proactively with the Biosafety Committee and providing the data that they're requiring and requesting, and we just stay flexible with the process. So this is where the process is at today in China. Thank you so much for your attention today.